Welcome to the third episode of the SyncUp. Community is the new moat. On this episode, we have our host, Michael Martocci, meet with the co-founders of Commsor, Jacob Peters and Mac Redden. Building your brand isn't just about placing ads and providing a service. Customers want more than that. They want a brand they can identify with, a brand that gets them. They want a community. Commsor is helping top brands on doing just that. We speak with the founders about their journey and how communities is the new moat.
Hey everybody, how's it going?
Hey.
we covered our mic, our cameras with some, so you couldn't see us. That's our magic trick for the day. Welcome to the group. So this is I think it's our third installment, of SyncUp with SwagUp. We're calling it a live podcast series. Some people might call it a webinar, a virtual conference. We're calling them live podcasts. So thanks to Helen for putting these together. The last couple have been really good. The first one was with Fringe, really cool employee benefit software. Lots of fun, good benefits that people actually care about, like ClassPass and Blue Apron. There was also, then next up was Burn Rate that we did yesterday. Talking through, sales planning and operating plans. It's a SaaS software to do that. Rob is awesome. And then keeping the theme of awesome founders that we have good relationships with. We have Mac Redden and Jacob Peters from Commsor today. So really, really excited to talk to these guys. Mac, you got a sweet name. Jacob, you got a good name too, but Mac's got a sweet name. But we're really excited to have you guys. And for those who don't know, we'll get into it a little bit more, but Commsor is a community management, community building platform, really kind of hitting on this new wave of how to build an audience and traction and growth within businesses. And their community is huge, and there's a lot of great examples of companies that are doing it well. And Commsor is providing the tools to really prove out the ROI of community and help you kind of get the most out of it. So we'll jump into it real quick, and we'll just dive into the first one. So Mac and Jacob, I guess all these questions will be basically for both of you. A little unorthodox to do three people kind of in one setting, but I think it'll work out pretty well. So the first thing I want to talk through is, rather than just your story, where did your entrepreneurial sparks come from individually, growing up?
That's the question of who goes first, right?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean,
take us away, Jacob.
There's some parallels here. So
I guess this is an interesting one. And the funniest part of all of it is that this is something that I used to be super embarrassed to admit or tell my friends about. But now I'm out here, shouting to the world, and I'm on the podcast circuit, sharing the story. But it's an interesting one. So I guess my entrepreneurial journey started when I was probably 12 years old. And I was the kid that never outgrew the hobby of Lego building, right? Like the children's plastic building block toys. And I would build these big creations. And then one thing led to another. And I realized that there was a business opportunity where I could go out to places like garage sales and Craigslist.com and find kids' secondhand collections that they were just completely discarding or selling on the cheap, right? So I'd buy tens of thousands of bulk bricks from these different kids. I'd figure out which sets were actually in those big unsorted lots, rebuild them back into the original sets, and then resell them on the internet for a 10 to 20x ROI. And the crazy thing is that Mac actually had a very similar discovery when he was around that age, and I'll let him share.
Yeah, so with Lego bricks as well, but it's slightly different. I realized that you could buy new Lego sets and part the individual pieces out for more than the full set cost. Because people who wanted,
Lego
tons of specific. Yeah, people who want and I actually had a whole algorithm where I'd track sets that came out and identify all the piece values and figure out which sets had the best ROI. So Jacob likes to say, I joke that mine was slightly more sophisticated than going to garage sales and buying used Legos, but it's very similar. Neither of us knew each other at the time. We're in different parts of the country. And that actually is what how we became friends, was we both realized we had this sort of past entrepreneurial Lego business that had gotten us started, and and here we are.
So Jacob, you're sorting through random Legos to figure out which ones are part of a set, or how'd that work?
It took years of pattern recognition honing. You're not just going to on day one see a big lot of tens of thousands of pieces and figure out, okay, that piece belongs to that set, that piece belongs to that set. It was just a long time of training and understanding and recognizing. And eventually I kind of built a mental model, and I could just you see a big lot for $100 of 10,000 pieces and realize, okay, I know that piece is to that set. I can sell that set for $75. I'm buying the whole lot for 100. And I think I can make a 7 to 10x ROI here. So that was some of the calculations that went into it.
Mac, what was your margin and markup on your model?
I mean, it depended anywhere from like 5 to 7x on a set. So you buy a set for $100, and then what I did was I'd actually like wait for like a Target or a Walmart to put a set on sale, and if I knew that set had good ROI, I'd go buy 20 of it. So it's like a set is $100, now it's on sale for 60, and you buy that and then part it out. And my parents always got upset. They're like, "Why are you getting like 30 of the same Lego set? What's the point of this?" And one of the best things was, as Lego fans, you're able to like keep the parts you wanted, right? So like maybe you'd reduce your ROI on some sets because you'd keep some of the parts, but you were basically getting paid to keep the Legos you wanted.
So if you were at like 5 to 7x and Jacob got up to 10x, probably if you adjust it for effort level, it's probably somewhere around the same. Because I feel like Jacob's one was a little bit more laborious in terms of figuring out all these sets.
Yeah, mine got to the point where it was like semi-automated, right? Where I just like new set came out, like plug the parts into a spreadsheet, figure out if it was worth buying, buy it or don't buy it. And then,
that's crazy.
I'd come home from school and basically parting out pieces to send orders out versus instead of doing my homework. And that's when I like had to shut it down because I was like, all right, you got to do your homework before you're like sending out Lego orders.
You don't need to do it. So like, how is that? Have you seen signs of that and inklings of that kind of trickling into work now, like the skill sets and like you're talking about pattern recognition? Has that kind of fed its way into the startups that you've built since then, and the different ways that you guys are doing it? Is that kind of how you guys split up roles now a little bit within the company?
I think the best way to answer that question is to draw a parallel between the Lego community and the industry that we're in now, which is obviously professional community builders. So in addition to starting these big e-commerce companies kind of out of our parents' garages and basements with Lego, we naturally got really involved in the online adult Lego community building world. So there were dozens of different forums where there were adults and professionals who were the ones actually buying, the sets on the other side of the storefront that Mac and I were selling that were building these creations. So we started partaking in those. And I think that was our first big introduction into the online community world. And this was, 10, 15 years ago, before digital communities was big and exciting and as ubiquitous as it seemingly is right now.
Yeah, I mean, community is not new. I mean, they've been going on for forever. Like you said, Pokemon and baseball cards and Lego and influencers online. And there's this guy Drew Canoli from Organifi. He built his business off of Facebook, pages and Facebook groups back in 2009, 10, 11. Building a community around vegetable juicing, and then now he has $100 million supplement brand. So. In the crevices of the internet, community has been huge in all different like little niches. And now we're starting to see it kind of enter mainstream, it seems a bit, where, big companies, Fortune 500 startups starting to adopt it as like a growth channel. So what kind of is the path that led you guys into community and ultimately Commsor?
Yeah, I mean, I think as Jacob said, I think both of our first kind of introductions to the world of community, without knowing it at the time, was in getting involved in these Lego communities as a way of helping our businesses at the time. And then when I was 19, I sort of accidentally started my first real company based around a game called Minecraft, which I think at this point everyone has heard of, but it's like all like little virtual blocks in this world. It's very similar to like virtual Legos.
Yep.
I basically started using Minecraft as a sort of like a content and a game engine and building things on top of it, and then provide a centralized place where players could come and interact with each other, play these different games. And I basically built a very large community around this content we were creating. At the time, didn't really think of it as a community business, but I think that was like the stepping stone that led to Commsor was building that business and getting involved in like building a community of my own versus just piggybacking off of the existing ones.
Yeah, and I had a similar experience. It wasn't in the digital world, it was the physical world. So when I moved to New York, a number of years ago, I accidentally started what eventually became one of New York City's largest communities of data science professionals. And that's what my former career path was. I was working at a big bank doing quantitative research. And on the side was like, okay, I want to do something extracurricular. I want to upskill my data science and my data analytics skill set because that's the sexy thing. So I would get together with friends in coffee shops on weeknights. And like we'd read the latest, artificial intelligence white paper, super nerdy stuff that I'm slightly embarrassed to admit. But, naturally friends of friends started getting invited. And next thing I know, it started to become a proper community. and we made a large Slack chat. We had a meetup chapter. It ballooned to like 6,000 people over the course of 9 months. And next thing I know, I'm kind of in this position of accidental community leadership and authority. And was in a bit over my head because it just took so much time and tender love and care to keep this group engaged and consistently put on, creative events, find speakers, meeting space. Like we ended up getting a partnership with Microsoft, but that took, a hell of a lot of cold emails and a lot of trial and error to get right. So it was a big challenge running that. And that's around the same time that Mac and I had started to become good friends. And we were talking about some of these challenges and pain points. And we're like, okay, why don't we leverage, our community learnings from the Lego days, what you've done building the Minecraft business, and my community experience running this community of analytics professionals in New York to solve some of the biggest community management challenges and pain points that we see in the market. So that was the birth of Commsor a little over a year ago.
And you were at a full-time job at what, JP Morgan or something?
Yeah, that was it. So we probably quit and Mac was head of product at an ed tech startup in New York. So, we were both moving up the career ladder, I guess, had objectively awesome, stable jobs, but we definitely quit them a little bit too early before we'd had a business model. It was just a little bit,
we didn't have any business model.
We had no business model. Just two guys with an idea.
Yeah, we put our 2-week notices in like 2 weeks after we're like, we have an idea. Boom, let's do it. And, it worked out, but I don't know if I'd recommend that level of aggressiveness to anyone.
And was it because you just knew that you just didn't fit in like a corporate structured environment? Because like I worked at a VC firm for like 3 months, once, like literally once. And then after that, we started this company, and, I've always like you guys growing up, very entrepreneurial, had lots of different businesses. And I just knew very quickly that I wasn't going to thrive in a structured environment. So, was that kind of the impetus? Like you were kind of looking for a way out first off anyway, and then it happened to be a good idea. Like, let's run with it.
100%. I think for me, the job I was in before Commsor was my first and only ever like traditional job. And it was far from a traditional job because it was like a 10-person startup. We didn't have an office. So, not a very traditional job either way, but by my standards, having always done my own thing, it was my first time I had like a proper boss to report to and whatnot. So I was definitely I was basically at that job until I had the next idea, was kind of my mindset.
Yeah, and I had a unique experience at JP Morgan in the sense that my team was actually very entrepreneurial and nimble and agile, which is atypical of a big clunky organization that's been around for 200 years. So I kind of made the most of it while I was there, but I'd always had that same burning entrepreneurial itch and spirit as Mac that we kindled since we were like 12, 13 with the Lego businesses. So I just knew it was a matter of time that even though I had a great time at JP, it wasn't going to be enough to satisfy my insatiable thirst to do my own thing.
Yeah. Mac, did you go to college or no?
I did 1 year, and then, like I said, accidentally started this Minecraft business. When I say accidental, I really truly mean doing it for fun. And all of a sudden it made money, and then it made more money. I was like, oh, I should probably hire someone to help with this. And all of a sudden, a year later, it's 10 people. And I dropped out of college with the intention. Well, originally it was, I'm going to take a break, see where this business goes. If it fails, I can always go back. It didn't fail. And so I never finished school.
The same parents that were telling you to do your homework, what were they saying when you left school after 1 year?
I think they were like, okay, like you don't really know what you want to do. That's fine. Like you'll go back in a year, and like a year, like, are you going to go back? And I'm like, no, the business is going well. And then like another year, like, are you going to go back now? Like, no, things are going well. And I think it's stopped now, but for the first 3 or 4 years, there was a constant like, all right, like the business is going well, but when are you going back to school? And I think at this point they've given up asking that question. But
yeah, I think Jacob, did you finish at UVA?
I did, yeah. So I got the degree, but my parents are saying the same thing now about master's degree, and I'm like, Mom, Dad, you have absolutely no idea. Like you'll learn more in a month of a startup than you will in 2 years of an MBA program. I mean, the feedback loops are just so much shorter.
Oh yeah, and they're so much more real too. You just feel it, emotionally. That there's nothing that ingrains in your mind more so than the feeling of like, loss or gain, or like, you have to hire people or you lose money, like whatever it is, like being able to actually feel the impacts of the decisions. And I think that's a lot of, there's a lot of talk about, consultants and consulting, and, the fact that you're always making kind of insights and judgments about things, but you don't get to feel the results. And like, what does that do for you long term in terms of like progressing? I think there's a lot to be said with, actually doing it.
Same thing with a lot of other careers and, investment bankers, like there's just not enough skin in the game, or the stakes aren't high enough where you're going to feel every high and every low. And that certainly, it changes the way you think about the world. And calibrates your emotions to a different, extent than you would ever get in a standard job.
Yeah, for sure. Well, let's jump into, community building itself and the platform and what you're seeing, because I know a lot of people are really interested in learning more about this. So, why do you think that community management and building a community is like a problem that needs to be solved right now? Like what's happening in the world that is leading to this?
So we're at an interesting time as a world and as a society, as a nation, all of the above, honestly, that they're just kind of creating a macro backdrop and a why now moment for community. And one of the major reasons is the fact that, people are just more and more, they're feeling alone. Like there's studies that are out there that say that 30% of millennials, really don't have any friends, or they don't have a single person that they could call their best friend, which is interesting, right? Because everyone has a smartphone, we're all on Instagram, everyone's on social media. So we're technically more connected than ever, but there's just this overall feeling of loneliness. And part of the reason for that is that we're seeing things like a decline in organized religion, declines in neighbors that live in neighborhoods and subdivisions or next to each other in apartment complexes, like hanging out less, right? People are staying inside, keeping to themselves, they're watching Netflix.
Especially now.
Yeah, especially now. I mean, Corona is just magnified and accelerated all of these trends that were kind of inevitable anyway. It's just accelerated 3 to 5 years. So that's kind of some of the backdrops. And then couple that with the fact that people are kind of fed up with the traditional ways of engaging online, right? There's been a big backlash against the kind of, privacy invasive nature of programmatic ads, social media data tracking, and all that type of stuff, and the sheer fact that it's these all-in-one social media platforms just aren't doing it for people anymore. So there is a need and a desire and a want and a lot of social factors that are leading people to finding and discovering and wanting to be a part of niche, more intimate community groups.
I think a good number I like to bring up, right, is if someone else follows you on Twitter, your existing Twitter followers don't get a benefit, right? In a proper community where it's a many-to-many relationship, members actually benefit when other members join and engage, which you don't see on traditional social media. You don't see that in advertising. If you have 500 Twitter followers, that's 500 connections, you to 500 people. If you have 500 engaged people in a Slack community, a meetup group, whatever it might be, that's 62,000 potential connections between those members. So the magnitude of impact of the same number of people is drastically higher with community-driven models versus traditional social-driven models.
Yeah, and I mean, traditionally, what have been the tools to kind of foster community? Like how whether it was Minecraft or Lego building or baseball cards or whatever the niche kind of interest is. How have communities kind of organized in the past, and how do you think they're going to organize in the future?
In the digital era, it started with forums and IRC rooms, right? If you go back 20, 30 years, there was an IRC room or a forum for any niche subject you could imagine.
I was
right?
actually just looking for a car, a BMW lease, and there's they have whole forums and all these people that, share their insights on what the deal they got. Like they're still pretty active.
Yeah, but they're not quite as prevalent. And then social media came along and kind of consolidated everything into all-in-one platforms, and that was the new greatest thing ever. And now we're seeing this shift back towards smaller, niche platforms where you can actually interact with people, get to know people. And there's actually this great theory. I can't remember who it was. It's the founder of Kickstarter,
Yancey Strickler.
There it is.
He went to William and Mary. He went to my school.
And he coined the term, the dark forest theory of the internet. And so the internet is becoming a dark forest, where if you go out into a dark forest at night and you stand there, at first glance, there's no life. Yeah, you might hear some crickets, but there's no life. But if you start looking under rocks or leaves, or you really know where to look, there is life everywhere. And that's what the internet's becoming, right? Like the dark forest where you can hear the crickets, that's the Twitter, that's the Facebook. The communities, though, are the looking under rocks, or if you don't know they exist, you would never know they exist, right? If you weren't specifically looking for that BMW forum, why would you ever know that BMW forum is there? And that inherently is what makes it more valuable, because there's less noise there.
Yeah. The bonds are so much stronger between the people within the community because they have that common interest and common kind of goals.
And it allows them to be specific, right? It's like they are there to talk about BMWs or cars. Whereas on Twitter or Facebook, you're more likely you are you, versus I can go to a photography community and be photography Mac. I can go to my startup community and be startup Mac. Whereas on Twitter, I'm just Mac.
Yeah, I think that's one of the benefits of going to college, and especially on a university campus, is being able to find your group of people and your tribe. And if you don't get that experience of going to school or being in places where there's lots of diverse kind of people and mindsets, it's hard to find the people that resonate with you. Especially even in a Twitter world, people don't share enough about themselves deeply to really feel a connection between them. But, with these like really niche communities, you start to find people that you really can relate to and dig deeper into. Because like you said, there's so much surface level relationships now, and it's hard to find people that you feel kind of understand you.
Yeah, like on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, where you put on a face, you put on like Twitter face, you put on Instagram face. Whereas like in these smaller communities where it's not going to be publicly discoverable forever necessarily. Like you're more likely to be yourself. You're more likely to be vulnerable. You're more likely to have a real conversation with someone. It does happen on social media, but very often behind this veil of fakeness.
Yeah. So what would you say if, when businesses ask you, like, what is the business case for community building? And what's kind of like the journey that they can anticipate going on, building out a community?
I think that the biggest I'll answer that question by starting with the misconception. And that's my company's treating community as a magic bullet, right? And I'll tell you right now, not every company should be a good candidate to start a community, right? Like there's this big misnomer that like, if you start a community, people will come and like people will join and it'll be successful. It's the same concept like in product building, right? It's like if you build a software product or a product, people will come. It doesn't necessarily work like that. So you have to almost like lay the seeds or make sure that there's the proper, community building like primordial soup in order for people to want to gather. So number one, there has to be a reason that's strong enough for people to gather in order for a community to exist and be successful and a business to support it. And to give you some examples of, some of those reasons, like and we'll probably get into this later, so I apologize if I'm giving everyone a teaser, but, we run a community ourselves for an audience that's very special and dear to our hearts, which is the community builder and the community manager, right? And for them, these are B2B professionals that do this every single day and they live and breathe this stuff. That's a reason to gather, right? Like they need to find jobs in the space. They want to learn secrets and share tips and tricks that other community builders are using and employing that they can bring into their own communities that they're building. Like those are strong reasons to gather. And like a community builder, it becomes like someone's identity, right? Like this is a career field that you feel a certain attachment to. Whereas like, if maybe you're a consultant or investment banker, potentially not so much. It might just be more like a clock in, clock out thing. I don't know. I'm not sure. I'm not going to be judgmental. But I think those are kind of some of the seeds that need to be planted in order for a company to even think about a community before you go to the business case. So, Mac, do you have anything to add?
No, I think that's great, right? The main thing there being like, community might not be right. It's like you don't necessarily. There are lots of businesses that don't need Twitter accounts or not every business needs everything.
Yeah, I mean, we didn't post on Instagram or Twitter for the first 2 years. Like you got to figure out what the channel is that works for your business, and kind of double down on it. But with that in mind, what are some of the types of businesses that you think community makes the most sense for, and what are some kind of case studies out there of businesses that you think are doing it really well?
Yeah, so I think with my background, I think an industry that's been doing it successfully and longer than any other industry is the gaming industry. But there's also like an inherent nature of like people gathering around games or products. Like you have gaming communities that are reaching into the millions of members and have been that way for decades. Beyond that, we've seen, just to go to some examples, like Figma or Notion in the more tech space have actually built like such a community that you'd almost call like it's a cult-like community around them. Someone could come around and rip off Notion. Like Notion's a great product, but it's not that unique or interesting. What's really unique and interesting, what's really strong is this community of people who love Notion more than a product, right? And it's this sense of belonging where like you're a Notion user. They have all these volunteers who are contributing to translate the product, or create templates or connect with their users and help them. And it's like, you can't beat Notion because you can't beat their community, not because you can't beat their product. Yeah.
So I think, Michael, to answer your question more specifically, it's if you have a product or you're operating in an industry where you can actually combine and create like incrementally like additional margin utility for a user by packaging a community with a product itself, right? Like it's not enough anymore to create, a software product or a hardware product or something that, you're sending to consumers. If it's a direct to consumer brand that people are buying from Instagram, like you need to make those users or those customers feel like they're a part of something bigger and part of a movement. So if you have that ability with your product, then community can be super beneficial.
Yeah, and for people like in a startup environment who, like you said, they can only prioritize so many different things in different channels. And, let's say you're a marketer, and you want to prove yourself at the startup you're at, and you think that community, makes a lot of sense given, the industry, the type of product. What case, do you make to them? Have you seen, hard data in terms of, I know that you guys are big fans of like Lattice's community, for example, and some others like that. Have you seen some real anecdotes of, data, driven out of these communities in terms of like business performance?
I think the interesting thing is, data out of these communities to understand business impact is basically why we're building Commsor, is that it's been very hard to really prove the impact of the community. So a lot of the stories are very anecdotal, right? Community managers talking about like, they know this user didn't churn because they were able to interact with the community, or this user became a customer because of the community. But being able to get like the data behind it is actually one of the core reasons we're building what we're building. But yeah, there's definitely stories out there, and it's less data driven than it should be right now.
Yeah, and then I kind of divide professional communities, for startups, especially thinking about this, into almost like 4 different buckets. Like bucket number 1 would be a support-based community. So this is where, for customers that are already using your product, or you might have a lot of, individual users or developers or something that are using a software. If you can put people together in an environment where they can answer each other's questions, that's going to be beneficial to the business, because no longer do you have to have a support rep that's part of the equation. Right. So it's reduced support costs for you if you can get users answering one another's questions and participating in that manner. So that's kind of the kind of way in which companies can leverage this, number 1. Second would be as a marketing and an acquisition channel. So that's where companies can do things like basically create value and build a trusted relationship first, with no overt mentions of their brand. They're not trying to be salesy. They basically just want to deliver something completely for free in a hands-off manner. And guess what? If you're able to do that and, spin up a Slack community or a forum or a series of regional meetups, or even something as simple as like a newsletter, and you can give people value first, and it's community, they're probably going to want to talk to you and find ways to want to give you money eventually. And we've seen that firsthand with companies like you mentioned, Lattice, for example. A third type that comes to mind is where you can actually create communities that become salespeople on your behalf. So it's like armies of evangelists. And this is what companies like Figma and Notion have started to do, where they basically like intertwined, the feeling of being a community or a community member with the product itself. So, when you're a Notion user, you're not just using the product for its utility. You're also, a part of the community. You want to go tell all your friends about Notion. You want to host a Notion meetup, or create a Notion template and things like that. So anytime you can start to, activate an army of evangelists and have them be your salespeople and your loudest voices, that unlocks some incredible abilities for a company.
Yeah, and it's super, like you said, it's super efficient. You're empowering these people to work on your behalf, to advocate for the company, to, like you said, answer support questions. If you talk shit about Notion on like a tweet, you're going to get beat up by the army. Same thing as like I was telling you, like Elliot. The guys from Elliot, they're doing a pretty good job of building a cult following around their brand. And you start saying like, oh, this is vaporware or something, you're going to have like 30 people on your ass, like in your Twitter DMs, like telling you that you don't know what you're talking about. And I think how passionate people get about, topics around your business is a good indicator probably of, how strong the community is that you're building. So how does kind of Commsor fit into all of this? Like what exactly is the core problem that you're trying to solve, and how are you doing it, and what's the plan kind of ultimately for the platform?
Yeah, I mean, the core problem stems from the fact that very often these communities are very segmented, right? Your community is not just your Slack channel. It's not just your email newsletter. It's every place you're having touch points with community members, close to you and far from you. It's your social media, it's your email newsletter, it's your meetups, it's your Slack, it's your forums, it's all these different touch points that don't communicate with each other. And it's very, very hard, if not impossible, to actually define what this community is, what it looks like, how big is it, how's it growing, how's it doing? Like, if this person is in your Slack, are they also on your newsletter? So the core of what we're trying to build is essentially kind of like, we call it a CNM, a community network manager, but it's sort of like a CRM for community. So it's starting to actually identify what your community looks like and visualize it in a way that helps you. Like, you can't build a better community or understand its impact if you don't know what the community is. So that's the core of what we're building. And long term, we're trying to build we like to use the analogy, what Salesforce is to a sales team or HubSpot is to a marketing team, we want to build for the community team. So it starts with creating the golden source set of records where you understand the community, and then how do you use that to enable you to build a better community, or pull the thread all the way through to understand the impact it's having if it's a support community, or the impact it's having if it's an acquisition community, or the impact it's having if it's a community of ambassadors.
Awesome. Yeah, I mean, we use the platform ourselves. I mean, anybody that signed up for this, live podcast signed up through Commsor, and you guys are kind of just getting started out, but it's already very powerful just from a standard kind of use case, and kind of piggybacking off of the success of popular tools like Slack and Zoom, like that are the core of building out the community to start. I think it's really smart to kind of leverage that to help get that traction, and there's so many avenues you can take this. And the data will be really interesting to prove out. And like you said, you're building out the category, and it's a whole entire new channel for businesses that they can really think about from obviously there's a lot of emotion around community and there's that part of it, but you'll be able to let them see the metrics and the data behind the effectiveness of building out and thinking about it more strategically than, just this idea kind of up in the air.
I think we're at a point where, if you look at 10 years ago, customer success didn't exist. That wasn't really a department you would have. You didn't have a head of customer success. That wasn't even a role. And then certain software platforms came along and said, hey, customer success is this new thing. Like the Gainsight came along. It's not really customer support. It's its own thing. And it's different because of X, Y, Z. And we're seeing a similar shift happen right now, where previously community has kind of been lumped in as this sort of like bastard child, where it's like kind of customer support. It's kind of customer success. It's kind of marketing. It's not quite clear which maybe it falls under most of the time. And we're seeing this shift where community is actually becoming its own department that's standalone. Yeah, it does touch all those different aspects, but it's its own thing that needs its own rules of operation, its own tools, its own analytics, and that's what we're trying to build.
Yeah, so you see teams being built around community, head of community, and people on the team as well. I mean, because we deal with a lot of community managers. We deal with a lot of community managers or heads of community at SyncUp, because Swag plays a huge role in building out the communities, especially if you look at like the gaming community. They're huge into branded merchandise, and because it's all about this common thread that ties everybody together, and Swag is a part of that. When everyone sees the sweatshirt or the hat like you guys did, it's a bond that people share. Same thing as if you go to UVA, everybody wearing the UVA t-shirt or the hat or the sweatshirt, it brings people together, and especially if you're outside of the community and be able to see that person, you initially just immediately feel comfortable with that person. So we're seeing that a lot. Especially the crypto companies. A lot of the crypto companies are huge into community building, and a lot of times the companies at the bleeding edge are foreshadowing what's going to happen, for everybody. So I definitely agree. I see that a lot of that is kind of starting to materialize, and it's really becoming its own thing. And you guys have a really great opportunity to kind of own that category and help push that. And with that in mind, what are some things that you guys are doing to kind of foster this whole community around community builders?
I mean, I think the start is, as Jacob mentioned earlier, we actually, before we even started building product, we started building our own community for community builders, right? Community first. That's our entire kind of company mantra. And for us, it's been like the greatest way ever to get research on what we're actually building. Right? We now have 800 and something community managers and community builders in a Slack channel who are giving us feedback and input all the time around the problems they're facing, what they want our product to do, what it should look like. And then on top of that, we're trying to create content and spread the word that, and prove that community is so valuable and should be something that companies are focusing on through things like, we're doing similar events to this, where we're talking to, people who are leading the edge on community and helping them spread the word. We actually threw a whole virtual summit last week. It was 2 days with 42 or 43 different community speakers, basically like the top community builders in the world, sharing their insights and thoughts around community. So a lot of it is like, we're building the product, but we're also trying to push the entire world of community to the forefront.
Jacob, how's it been so far? How do you guys split up the time? Or do you get involved in the community building side, or is that more Mac? Like, how are you splitting up responsibilities within the company?
I think admittedly we both do a little bit of everything right now. I'd say the majority of my job is business development, talking to potential customers, understanding their use cases, building relationships, and Mac heads up our engineering team and kind of has the vision for the product.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, like I said, I think, if I could have invested when you guys were raising around, I think it would have. I haven't gotten into the whole world of angel investing yet, but we love promoting the platform to to our clients, and again, like, we're going to continue to be power users. Doing building out the community that you have so far, and in that first event, were there any kind of misconceptions that kind of came up where maybe you thought community was one thing, you thought that it would go one way, and it actually wasn't quite like that, or major uncoverings that might inform future kind of product decisions maybe?
I think a big learning was that, community is more than the platform than which it exists on, right? So we started with the Slack community, and there's a big misconception among companies. It's like, okay, I start a Slack, that's my community, right? Like, I run a Slack community. And I'd argue that that's not necessarily the case. Like, you run a community, which is a collection of people, and Slack just happens to be one of the platforms in which they gather. But in fact, community can be so much more than that, right? Like, we have created this like multi-channel, multi-touch point experience across a lot of different places where community members can kind of pick and choose the ways in which they want to interact with us, right? For example, we have our weekly newsletter if you want to be a bit more of a passively engaged member. We have our Slack community where the conversation never stops. It's going 24/7. It's like a fire hose of information and people sharing tips and tricks about community building. Then we have something like our virtual summit, which was a big event that we'll probably only do every few months. We have weekly and monthly events as well, like fireside chats, just like this. So there's really like 6 or 7 different, we also have a resource library, by the way. So there's like 6 or 7 different ways that people can choose to interact with us and consume content and like be a part of the community. It's not just like you're in the Slack and that's your community membership. It's so much more and goes so much more beyond that.
And then do you anticipate, taking some of that into the platform then? And, is it, a matter of lots of integrations? What do you think is kind of the next stepping stone for the platform?
Yeah, I think it's a lot of integrations, right? Like, most people we talk to, their community really lives across 4, 5, 6, 7 different channels, as we've mentioned. And a lot of it is trying to both tie the kind of community manager experience together so they have a cohesive place where they can kind of manage and understand all these different channels together, but then also starting to throw like pieces of that are like more user facing to help make their experience more connected, right? It's like, if you've got events, someone shouldn't have to go and like log into a separate event system to sign up for your events, or someone shouldn't have to go and like, you don't want your community experience to be disconnected for the user either. So it's like there's kind of 2 ways we're going. We're very focused on this more back-end piece right now with community managers, but there's a lot of room to make the experience better for members as well.
No, for sure. And you have to think of your community as like your users almost. Like, you have to think about it as a product, and how do I make adoption as easy as possible? How do it's like the same thing as product management.
Yep, there's definitely a lot of parallels between creating a product and creating a community. And that's another misconception, right? Is that people think that community is something that they can just do as on the side, stick a person 10% of their time on it and it'll grow and it'll be just fine. But it really is something that you have to fully commit to, have a dedicated resource or 2 or a whole team or someone who's kind of evangelizing it and in the driver's seat to shape the vision and nurture it and grow it. Otherwise it's going to be a failure and no one's going to re-engage.
No, for sure. Cool. Well, I think we covered a lot of really awesome stuff. I think this is, for any business out there that's thinking about community, I think, like you said, you have to think hard and say, okay, are we actually going to commit the resources to it? Does this make sense given, our type of product? But if it does, from what I've seen and from what you guys have seen, it's one of the strongest, like we said in the advertising kind of to get up to, it's one of the strongest moats that you can build in a world where, moats are becoming kind of difficult to come by. Everything is becoming kind of like, I don't even know the best way to describe it, but like everything's so accessible. It's hard to find ways to differentiate yourself in paid ads or, partnership channels, because, everything has been kind of commoditized to a degree. And community is really one of those last things that you can really hold on to and own. And I think it's really important and really timely, especially as every day there's another startup, tens and hundreds of startups, especially with all this funding going on. And especially now in an environment where a lot of people were laid off, you're going to see a lot of innovation and companies starting. And, it's so much more about distribution than it is, the product itself. Like, you need to have that loyal following. You have to have a way to get your message out to them, not just, like you said, you don't just build it and they come, and whether that's a product or a community. So I think that I think you guys are hitting stride at the right time. But let's open it up to questions from people in the group. Lucas, I saw that you sent me an email this morning. So thanks for joining us in the group. But anybody in the group have any questions that they want to bring up to Jacob, Mac, or myself?
Yeah. Hey guys, I had a question for you. So I actually think it's really cool what you did with SwagUp, honestly, like what the company is really based off of and everything like that. I recently started my own company, not necessarily similar to SwagUp, but more of like a design company. And would you say in regards to building community, because I have like my social media right now, like my personal one, and I also manage my business's social media, would you say sometimes less is more? So in regards to trying to build a community, like, you guys are talking about like forums and things like that, but right now I'm basically just focused on Instagram. Would you say like it's best to just stay on that platform, or would you say it's best to try to maybe get on Twitter or try to get on something else to try to maybe broaden my network?
I'd say the first thing you need to think about is like, how do you want to define community personally? Because it's a pretty ambiguous term. Everyone thinks about it a little bit differently. In Mac and I's opinion, community at its core is a many-to-many experience in the sense that, it takes place on tools and platforms and physical places where you can put people together and there's an incremental network effect benefit of others joining, right? So in the analogy Mac said earlier, if you have 500 Instagram followers, that's 500 people that have a one-way connection to you. But if you have 500 people in a Facebook group, every combination of members becomes like, 60,000 different ways in which people can interact. Like that's exponentially more valuable to the collective whole. So that's how we start to define community, and that's how we start to think about it. So I don't really define traditional social media as community per se.
Okay.
I mean, just generally speaking, in terms of like where you're going to get distribution or get in front of people, I mean, I've always been of the kind of opinion that you should focus in on, specific niches and platforms where you're going to be most effective and you're going to be dedicate time to and really understand the platform and all of that. Like Mac was saying earlier, it doesn't necessarily benefit anybody for you to like, oh, we post this one YouTube video like once a month and then we tweet whenever I have some time while I'm on the phone. And, people like to see kind of, dedication and know what to expect out of it. But like Jacob was saying, like, building your audience and building a community aren't necessarily the same thing, and being clear of like what that goal is and how you're going to, achieve that, and what is the vessel and vehicle that you then, foster that community. Because those social platforms aren't necessary ways to do that, but they are potential like distribution channels to get people into the community.
Yeah, I think it's a big difference, right? Whether you're building an audience or a community, right? And for different businesses, different ones are better, right? And an audience is very much like you to them, versus like it doesn't make sense to build a community unless you have a very strong reason for this, like the why. Why do the people following you on Instagram want to connect with each other versus just with you? And if you have a clear-cut answer to that, then maybe it makes sense to explore a community. But otherwise, I think also in your early stages, master one platform and understand exactly what you're doing there and how it's working, and then figure something else out. Very often you see people who are like, oh, I'm going to launch a Slack and a forum and LinkedIn and Twitter and Instagram. And they do all of them really poorly rather than doing one of them really well.
Yeah.
Calvin, you said to look up Mighty Networks. What is Mighty Networks?
So Mighty Networks. Hey, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, cool. Yes, I was just joining on my phone. Yeah, so Mighty Networks is a really cool platform that I found because I've always had an interest for building communities too, just different things that I've done within my career here. And so Mighty Networks, I figured out, is this company. I think they have $10 or $50 million in funding, and they actually are a platform where you can build your own community. And what they realize is like there's different things like Facebook, and you have like kind of what Lucas was mentioning is you have all these different channels, and they try and basically build out a platform that consolidates all of those different features. So you can have messaging, you can build out groups, you can post different things like you would on Facebook groups, and basically have this whole go-to place for building out a community. So I think that would be really great for something like Commsor to kind of integrate with, because then you also have all the other different things you're doing, like the webinars and the meetups. And so that Mighty Networks is a great place to kind of start, and then you can kind of dive off of that and open up to different outlets and channels.
Yeah, Mighty Network is awesome. It's kind of like a white label, like build your own Facebook type thing, right? It's like you kind of build your own white labeled social network.
Interesting.
Yeah, and we've seen a few dozen companies just like Mighty, maybe not quite as big as them yet, pop up over the past few months. They're probably in the lead in that space in terms of funding, as you said. But those platforms can be great. It's just you always have to be conscious of the trade-offs, right? Like if you are to start a community on Mighty Networks, then guess what you're doing? You're asking users to download another app, which is always a challenge and always a point of friction when it comes to re-engagement, right? But if you're starting something on Slack or Facebook groups where your users are already spending a lot of time for things like work or pleasure, it's not that big of a lift to be like, hey, why don't you just click this button and join another group, as opposed to like downloading another app and then like consciously having to incorporate the habit of checking that app and opening it on a weekly basis into someone's workflow, which is a pretty challenging thing. So yeah, apps like that can be great. You just have to be conscious of the trade-offs.
It very much depends on your scale, right? If you're Nike, you could create your own app, which they do, and be like, everyone go download this app because we're Nike and people will do it. If you're a tiny company just starting out, yeah, exactly. But like if you were starting your own shoe company right now, you probably couldn't get people to download your own Run Club app. You could probably get them to join your Facebook group though and talk about running there. So like it's this trade-off of like where do you start and what are you able to do, right? It's a lot easier to start by building where your users already are.
No, yeah, for sure. Yeah, you have to like cut out friction. It's the same thing. Like we talked about building a product. You don't build, you guys have grand ambitions of what you want Commsor to be. I'm sure you'd want 100 more features and functionality right now, but what's the easiest way to get people through the door and get started, and we'll level up and add on top of it. But like you said, the hardest part is going from 0 to 1, getting that initial traction. What can we do to eliminate as much friction as possible? And then from there, you've earned the right to then do stuff like that, build a community on another platform. What's your kind of feeling and opinion on Facebook groups, and how does it fit into the whole like community building kind of, community in general? And, are you seeing businesses use it a lot? Is it something that you would want to integrate with? And do you think that they maybe missed the boat on, leveraging that more?
I mean, personally, I'm one of the, I don't have a Facebook account type person. So that says how I feel about Facebook personally. But I think Facebook groups is very popular with more like, B2C consumer type brands. Once again, it also depends, right? Like it depends on where your audience is. If you're building a product for developers, Facebook groups probably makes no sense. If you're doing a product for new moms to buy, Slack probably doesn't make sense. So you have to know your user to understand the platform. And it's actually less the platform that matters. It's like if you do a good job building community, the platform is secondary, right? You can do a good job anywhere. We've seen tech companies do really good job building Facebook groups and really active ones, and we've seen them go on Slack and completely fail, and vice versa with other types of companies. As far as Facebook missing the boat, I think it's a very closed wall, right? And that's always the challenge, where it's like it's very much owned by Facebook. It's very limiting what kind of information you can get out of it. It's at Facebook very often like tries to shove down your throat around like the idea of like pay to promote your group or pay for ads. It's like you always have to remember like Facebook's business model is advertising, and if it's free for you to use, right, you're the product. Yeah.
Do you think if privacy becomes a bigger and bigger issue with Facebook, where do you think those groups migrate to? Is it Mighty? Is it Slack? Is it?
Yeah, migrations is a tough thing. We've seen a lot of communities try to migrate, and oftentimes they don't really survive. So it can be challenging to decouple like the community from the platform itself, especially when it becomes a very ingrained thing. So migration is a whole nother can of worms that we could probably spend a whole hour talking about.
Yeah, we've seen a lot of people go from like Slack to Discord and then say, oh crap, we're going back to Slack because no one came with us.
Yeah, and you probably lose another 20-30% every time you make the jump. So people are used to habit, and then once you break the habit, it's kind of very difficult to get back into it.
Yeah, I mean, if your community is inactive, switching is, you might as well consider it a starting fresh approach. But if your community is active, don't change what's working.
Yeah.
Even if there's other platforms like, oh, but they have this other feature, like your community members probably don't care. They care about the fact that there's an active community here, whether it's Facebook or Slack or Discord or in-person meetups. That's what they care about. They don't care about the features.
Yeah, and to summarize, it's really less about the tools and more about how you use it. As Max said earlier, like there's no such thing as a perfect community platform or perfect set of community tools. It's just all about you being comfortable with the trade-offs and making sure you understand the nuances of the tools and how they can be used and abused or their limitations. And then, having good execution. That's really the magic.
Yep. Awesome, guys. Well, this has been super valuable for us personally too, and I'm sure for everybody listening, because we want to build out a community. Again, we have to make the conscious decision to commit to it, to do it right. But I found it very insightful, and I'm sure other people will. And the need and use for Commsor is just going to grow and rise over time. And we're really excited to continue to use the platform and see it evolve and really see other companies really embracing this as a true, channel and piece of their business. And I think content like this and you guys getting out there more and more is only going to help push this forward. So it's been great talking with you guys. Any last thoughts? Where can people find you? What's the best way that they can help?
Yeah, I mean, if you're interested in community building, you can join our community and interact with like 850 other community builders right now, and I'll drop a link there shortly. We've got a great newsletter that goes out every week with great blog posts, great tweets, and our own writing around building community from varying topics. And then you can find Commsor's link from that page as well if you're interested in checking that out. But I'd recommend starting with our community, and that's our entire mantra, right? The community comes first. Product comes actually secondary, which is sort of like counterintuitive to what I think most startups do, but that's our model and it's worked really well so far.
Awesome. Yeah. I mean, it's worked well for like Kylie Jenner and and all of them too. So there's definitely something to it, but awesome, guys. Well, this will live on forever in a true podcast form. So anybody that wants to go back and watch it and resources to some things that we discussed, we'll have it all tied up in there and hopefully we'll keep these going, and I think everybody's really enjoying them. So thanks for being our third guest. And we'll talk to you guys soon.
Thanks, Michael.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, no worries. See you guys.
This podcast was brought to you by SwagUp. For any further information, visit swagup.com.